So, folks, welcome to the special plenary for day 2 for Urban Art. Thank you all very much for being here. My name is Gautam Bhan, and I teach here at the Indian Institute for Human Settlements. This final plenary for the day is a joint session. You notice we don't have separate paper titles. We and about 40 other people are part of a joint collective project that we are speaking of today. And actually, if I can have my slide, I'll show you what it is. This is us. Our project is called If Cities Could Speak. This is also the unveiling of our logo and our website, ifcitiescouldSpeak.com, designed in the room next to you by our fabulous colleagues in the comms department. So what you'll see in this is the keywords of the project that I'll introduce very briefly. First, the question of climate change. Second, the question of vulnerable settlements. And third, the question of health. So our basic premise is to think about how we understand the effects and experience of climate change in vulnerable settlements in cities of the global south, and in particular, the way these connect to health. So it's a whole lot of jumps we're trying to make at the same time. I want to say only a couple of things about this. One is that there is a very deliberate reason not to use the word informal settlements, but to use the word vulnerable settlements, because one of the key questions for us is how to hold on to different types of vulnerability: spatial, economic, infrastructural, and ecological. And to see the location of this question in vulnerable settlements, not as a site, it's just not where climate change happens, but the fact of what climate is and the way it is understood is shaped by where you actually think about it. And the where question and the particularity of the where question is at the heart of our project. The second thing is that this is one of the rare projects where we actually have the imperative and direction to give language as our core output. This is not a study or a research project that tries to show exactly how rising heat causes a shift in the morbidity patterns of sunstroke. It is not an epidemiological study that measures health impacts. It is not also a planning study that reminds us that vulnerable settlements are vulnerable. What we have been asked to do is to tell and offer a public discourse to say that scientists are very clear that climate change impacts health, but people aren't. And the question then is, how do you tell the stories of climate and health in a way that begins from the public and remains as a circulation language among the public? How do scholars and activists actually tell stories whose job is not scientific, technical knowledge production, but the production of language and public discourse? Stories that are in and of themselves enough and not an archive of larger arguments or conceptual inquiry. Which means that in this project, our core work is to make documentary films, is to make storylines, is to tell long-form fiction, is to draw, is to narrate, is to describe, not always to defend. And also to insist that all of these are forms of evidence, forms of data, forms of rigor, and they are as technically strong as an IPCC report or a climate model or a morbidity assessment or a public health survey. So that's the reason the project is called If Cities Could Speak, because we are interested in speech and in stories as argument as well as archive. The second part that I wanted to, the reason we're presenting this work today is because it is a work that also takes the idea of the global south seriously. This work is across India, South Africa, Kenya, and Sierra Leone. It is across 14 cities and sites in these countries. It is across a range of settlements, from inner city vulnerable settlements with long histories, like Kibera, where you will go in Nairobi, fishing villages like Mossel Bay in Freetown, the edge of Tiruvananthapuram and Kochi, the waste picker settlement in the north of Delhi, which you will also visit, and encampments in the middle of Cape Town and also on its peripheral post-apartheid geographies. So the nature of vulnerability is different, and it is not only the vulnerability of the informality that we're interested in. And one of the things that we wanted to do is we are a year and a half into this project, and we wanted to present now instead of later, partly to also make the point that the production of academic knowledge often spends a very long time waiting to be sure, and only puts out its arguments when it is sure, and then laments that the world has been moving while we have been waiting for peer review publications to turn into peer review print. So we have also decided that our stories are ours and will be told as they come. So the panel actually could have been called Breadcrumbs, which is what our first written output of this project is, which is to say we're also telling stories which we are ourselves discovering. We're telling them mid-field work. We're telling them as they emerge to us. We're telling them without clarity on what they add up to, because we believe that in their circulation, they do valuable knowledge work, even without our own conclusions. So what you will hear today are two things. From me, you will now hear three possible arguments that are emerging from our work. And this is something I think that's important methodologically, because one of our other challenges is how do you make arguments across 4 countries and 14 cities? How do you make arguments that can hold on to the specificity of each of these sites, but also speak collectively across them in a way that isn't reductive? So breadcrumbs for us are narratives that seem to have something to say in each of our places, and each of our places have something to say to them. So what you'll see is I will lay out the 3 narratives, and then in Delhi, in Freetown, in Nairobi, in Cape Town, we will have each of the sites talk to those narratives and show you how they play out there. And part of the question for us also is, does it add up to a single argument? We don't know. But it does add up to a set of stories that seem to want to stay together on the same page, as opposed to sometimes when we write, when it feels like we are holding arguments hostage by force on the same page. So we're going to try and see how that works. And so here are the narratives. The first is an argument there. The first for us is that the language in which people talk about both episodic and everyday climate change is mediated through their life worlds, their places, their work, their bodies, their histories, their cultures, and their tongues. People know that the climate is changing. There is no lack of awareness. No one needs to be educated. It's just the language in which they speak of climate change is not always the language of the IPCC. But importantly, sometimes it is the language of the IPCC, and both of those stories need to be told. The second is very often when you speak of climate change within vulnerability, the question we ask is, how much you know something is also a product of what you think worth considering and articulating. Within deep vulnerability, what is worth knowing is always in some parts linked to what you feel you can do something about. So Nairobi, after catastrophic floods, talked a lot about climate change. Before, not so much. Knowledge is also a moment in time. It is also a motivation. It is also what we are forced to think about, not just what we want to think about. Our second narrative is that climate change must be emplaced, and that it settles into vulnerable settlements in particular ways, moving along the fault lines of risk and vulnerability. So there was never a water drain in many of our settlements. There was never a sewage system. There was never sanitation. But the way you feel the absence of a stormwater drain in a settlement changes when the nature of rain and floods change. The drain was always missing, but the meaning of that absence is what deepens. The second realization in our arguments is that risk needs a language that has the smell, the touch, the feel, the form of what is present. People make different forms of risk feel tangible. Risk can hold scale and time and abstraction. Speaking about something like climate change needs these multiple languages of risk. And the last that was important to us, because many times within deep vulnerability, the idea is if everything is bad and broken, then how does it matter if one more thing breaks? But just because risks are multiple, simultaneous and intertwined, doesn't mean that people can't pull them apart in our stories. Heat in a waste worker settlement is different when the heat waves come more often, even if heat is otherwise always constant. Our third is that climate change and its health effects need to be layered with other determinants of health and illness in vulnerable settlements. These are knotted and intertwined with each other. Illness is not new to these worlds, it is a constant. Climate change is delta. The difference or addition here is harder to pull apart when risk and vulnerability are so near universal. And importantly, it can feel cruel to notice this only because of climate change. We should have been noticing that people in vulnerable settlements are often sick anyways. And in real politics, we may not, as academics, be able to give any reasonable differentiation that heat stress, diarrhea, sunstroke, typhoid, and jaundice is somehow worse, or that it has gone from 90% to 92%. But in real politics, climate change may get us in the door to talk about health, to talk about vulnerability, to talk about place. Maybe this is the drum whose beats will finally get heard. So some part of our knowledge enterprise is also strategic. We may not need the scientific evidence of climate change, but we may need its ability to get us a seat at the table to talk about things we should anyways have been talking about. And our final is the question of response. In vulnerable settlements, responding, coping, flourishing to these intertwined risks and vulnerabilities are a mix of individual and collective agency, spatial and infrastructural opportunity, as well as the health system. These are and factors. You need all three. Each aids the other when they work, each weakens the other when they don't, which means improving the PHC without changing tenure doesn't work. And giving tenure without building the PHC also doesn't work. And the questions of these intertwined conditions are part of the easy three-letter word called and. That is very easy to put in writing, but very hard to hold in practice. And finally, much of our research, instead of looking for the gap and looking for what is new, sometimes is just looking for even more reasons to do what we always knew was the right thing to do: upgrade, improve, repair, and retrofit. And if that is the way that knowledge works, then that is itself newness enough. And solving one end of the puzzle may never undo the whole knot in intertwined systems, and. But the opposite of where should we start is anywhere is fine as long as you get through the whole round by the end. So these four narratives, these four breadcrumbs, seem to us a year into our fieldwork to be part of the stories worth telling. And now what we'll do is we will tell you what these sound like and look like in the sites in our method, which are long-form health histories. We're happy to talk more about the method in the Q&A if you'd like. But now I will hand over to my colleagues Julia and Kanye Sile, one in the audience, one on the thing, presenting on behalf of our Cape Town team. And Julia, take us to Cape Town.
Hi, everybody. I'm Julia Hope, based at the African Center for Cities, and I'll be speaking on behalf of the team and work that Kanye Sile Bruko and myself have been doing in vulnerable settlements in Cape Town. So I'll begin by giving some context into the settlements that we're working in. I'll give an overview. Sorry, I've got my numbering mixed up. They don't correlate exactly to the numbering of the narratives that Gautam has presented, but I'll give an overview of the kind of layering, the fault lines of risk and the specific vulnerability, and I'll go into more detail around two specific narratives, around the vocabularies and the vernacular understandings of this relationship between climate change and health, and then also the kinds of responses that we're seeing and what can be said of the agency and constraints within these responses. So before I go to that slide, what does it mean to be speaking from Cape Town about climate change? Cape Town, which is often kind of thought of as a city of extremes, the most extreme inequality in South Africa, which is a country with the highest Gini coefficient in the world, a city with the highest murder rates in the world, with an average of 400 people being killed in a single month last year in October due to gang violence and intense organized crime. So a city of extremes, but when we turn to the climate change projections and patterns, we don't see such an extreme story. So Cape Town doesn't tell a story of apocalyptic or disaster narratives that often come to mind when speaking about climate change as a bogeyman of the future. Rather, we see relatively moderate projections of it's getting hotter, depends where in the city. There will be more drought in the future, and there will be more floods, which may seem contradictory. There's also a shifting seasonality. So winters are getting longer, summers are getting shorter, but exactly when the rains will begin and when the rains will end is becoming less clear. And these, I want to say, ambivalent projections are also reflected from the field. So I've just included one quote here of someone saying, in the year that has drought, then that rain arrives, referring to a new kind of rain, the heavy, bad rain. So our two sites are in Langa and in Site C. The specific site in Site C is called Taiwan. Langa and Site C, which is in Khayelitsha, are two historic townships, which I know has a specific meaning in South Africa, very different to the use of the term here. But they're two residential areas, townships, historically designed to house Black populations under the apartheid regime and not house families, not to sustain life, but to basically keep migrant labor, populations of migrant labor. And so that is the kind of infrastructural legacy that shapes these spaces. Langa is one of the oldest historic townships in Cape Town, and Khayelitsha, Site C, is more recent. And the site that we're working in Khayelitsha in Taiwan is primarily an informal settlement. So Langa, we've looked at a range of housing types. So these include an informal settlement and various pockets of informality, including backyards. The historic hostels, some of which have been kind of converted, not totally converted or upgraded, and some hostels which haven't been at all upgraded, the hostels that used to house migrant labor, and some illegal occupations, for example, in an old prison. And in Site C, we have been working in Taiwan, which is an informal settlement next to the N2 highway, which is the major, I didn't actually explain that, but both of these townships are on the Cape Flats. The city center is there, and they're along this main arterial passage into the city. So just to summarize, these are the main climate hazards that we're seeing. So seasonal ponding, it's just an everyday norm that people's houses are flooded every winter, that the water rises, and for months at a time, people will have their houses covered in water. Extremely heavy winds, drought, extreme heat, and extreme cold on a seasonal basis. To summarize, the main vulnerabilities that we're seeing is rampant unemployment rates between 30 and 40% of the population, poor infrastructure, congested housing, organized crime, and kind of secondary vulnerabilities being rampant food insecurity, chronic illness, illegal dumping, and settlement fires. I'll go through this quickly, but looking at the relationship between health and climate as mediated by these vulnerabilities and risk factors, these are kind of the dominant stories that we're hearing from the field. So the relationship between wind and health, people are speaking about stress and mental health. Wind as impacting fire and the likelihood of settlement fires, and as mediated by overcrowding, in the language of people that are speaking about it, inadequate building materials, inadequate responses from the city. For example, when it rains, the city often provides sails. When there's heavy wind, those sails catch alight, increases the likelihood of fire, as well as crime. So I'm going to just zoom into to number one there. And this was a quote from one of the residents in Taiwan, which is that we prefer wind to rain because when it's raining, we know that it's raining. When it's windy, you can't hear if it's a break-in or the wind. The wind is so painful, especially when you must sleep at night. So yeah, that's just to zoom into one of the examples of the layers. The next one I want to go into is, well, I'll briefly touch on, is, I think is quite interesting, is how rain makes fire. So settlement fires are a huge issue, specifically in summertime, very, very dry winters, intense winds. But something that was unexpected that came from the field is that during winter time, the rain actually makes fire because of where people are living, with informal electricity connections, poor infrastructure, and so the need to heat their homes in alternative ways. I've got a little, no, it didn't show up here. A little video which I can screen at the end, just describing the ways that rain makes fire. And so to touch on what Gautam was saying is that this is an opportunity to talk about things that should have been spoken about a long time ago. So how to bring the kind of crisis and temporal urgency that we have towards climate change to the chronic, slow, violent issues like high blood pressure, diabetes, ulcers, arthritis, and asthma. And this, when we're speaking about health in Langa and Taiwan, this is what people are speaking about. People are speaking about their high blood pressure, about their diabetes, and the way that this is impacted by climate hazards is rather clear when set out in such a way. For example, flooding, stress, high blood pressure, but also mediated by people's livelihoods and lack of employment. When there is a hazard, there's almost a direct impact on, if there's a hazard, not being able to work, impacts directly on people's food security and their chronic illnesses, which are listed alongside there. And we'll see examples of that as we go through. Something that's come out is that, which speaks very strongly to the idea of change, and I suppose a change or break from the past, is people are saying nowadays there's funerals every weekend because of chronic illness. People these days are dying from high blood pressure, and someone has referred to it as a kind of havoc that is shaping Langa these days. That it's causing havoc. People now don't have legs here. I can't read that quote. Or asthmatic people, they feel cold when it's cold or hot when it's hot, and then they go. And that, in this example, she was using that example to express that things have changed. They're no longer as they were in the past. I'm going to move on to the first narrative now, which is around, I suppose, doing justice to the way people are speaking about change and the vocabularies of the relationship between climate change and health. I'm not going to go into the ones listed here, but just one interesting term that came out of the field is ubushincha kwendalo, which means it's a change in what was originally designed. And that's what people are noticing. So things are different from how they were supposed to be, which may have a spiritual element, but however one understands the weather, it's not how it is meant to be. Also, just to go into the two terms below for the word for cold in isiXhosa, you have kuyabanda and ingele. And this was a big disagreement. Some people say, no, they're the same thing, it just means to be cold. Whereas other people are saying, no, it used to be cold, kuyabanda, but these days it's ingele, it's icy, and it's oppressing our plants. Continuing on this narrative of how hazard is articulated, it's articulated via the body. So people are speaking about the shift in increased flooding, and that these days we're constantly pushing water. So describing the process of sweeping out water from people's shacks, and almost on a continuous basis because it's a futile process. This was a really, I suppose, poignant, harrowing example where she actually lives in an upgraded home and is quite distraught at the fact that this long imagined upgrade is actually left her worse off than before. And describing the impact of the weather, specifically in this home, she articulates it through her body. And she says, the water goes down inside my chest. While I'm inside the chest, my house is wheezing. It's water. And it was actually confirmed by her daughter, or this understanding of it. She says, if it's raining, it's almost like it's raining inside her. Then when it clears, like today, it's how her chest is, it clears as well. Hazard is also articulated in relation, or in reference to relational places. So while people may not immediately speak about climate change where they are when asked, they'll refer to, for example, the Eastern Cape which is a province in South Africa from where many people moving into Cape Town come from. And so there's ongoing relationships between Cape Town and the Eastern Cape. Okay, I've been told to speed up. And reference to relational places can also be a coping mechanism. So referring to, I'm okay here, but people in the shacks or people in informal settlement are worse off when it comes to climate. And this comes after having articulated the devastating impacts of hazard. The language of climate hazards is also rooted in a context of post-apartheid political discourse. Almost a rights-based discourse, so following conversation about people's houses and the fact that they have not received infrastructure or services or adequate housing, that kind of shapes the way that people are speaking about climate change. So almost in a protest tone of, we want summer, summertime has come back now, and this lady actually sang it in a kind of chant, protest chant, or the weather should be, or supposed to be, mild and affordable. So because this kind of post-apartheid context of disillusion and neglect is shaping how people are speaking about climate change, it's influences how we track the change itself. And so people are making a very political affirmation that there has been no change in the settlement. And so when asking about the weather, people affirm it has not changed, it's still the same, which is often conflated or followed up by it's the same, it hasn't changed, it's becoming worse. But also just insistent that the winter is the same as it was, it's always been terrible. And so kind of identifying the actual changes is often, oh, sorry, I haven't mentioned. Identifying the actual changes is often kind of becomes or is registered through people's description of how they're coping just with everyday life. And that's in conversation about that, that's when people start speaking about, oh, actually, I have noticed that the weather has gotten worse, or the rain has gotten worse, because for the last 3 years we have had to wear gumboots, or because it was only 3 years ago when people started building these little cement walls or metal walls below their doors. And so it's through kind of noticing and speaking about adaptation that people are articulating a change or a break from the past. Or, for example, adaptations to health responses, getting the flu vaccine for the first time. I'll go through these quickly, but thinking about climate change as an agent of crime is very specific, is very relevant specifically to our one settlement where, yeah, it's a major mediating factor, but people's responses to crime exacerbate the impact of climate hazard, and people's responses to climate are circumscribed by this context of fear and unsafety. These are quotes that I won't read, but for example, saying I can't buy alternative or extra building materials because it might get stolen, or yes, the wind is terrible, specifically in this one settlement where because the crime is so bad, people had to cut down the trees, and now they're deeply affected by the wind. And this is a summary of kind of how we're thinking about agency. It's very much a work in progress, but the way people are responding to climate change and to the health impacts of this is through an agency that is circumscribed, calculated, cynical, and continuous, which I won't get into now.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Okay, I'm going to keep first moving and go to Mathews, who will take us to Nairobi.
Just waiting for the slides to come up. But even as I do that, I want to deepen the conversation that Gautam has started, build on what Julia has talked about, specifically around the language of climate change and health. And that is really important because then it lays the foundation in how we articulate and make and connect those dots around that relationship between climate and change. But it is this idea that what I'm coming from the field and some of what we observe is that climate change has lost its rhythm. And I think it's a theme that we are hearing even from Julia. It has lost its rhythm. It's not what it used to be. We expected it to be something else, but it's completely lost its head. And today, what I'm going to reflect here, what I'm going to show here is a collective process involving a team from the Nairobi team, different folks from different fields, urban planning, anthropology, climate change, folks from the community who I've worked with, but also a lot of conversations with our local interlocutors. And we try to stay close to the language and the experiences of the residents themselves. And I'll continue to share. But the main thing that we draw from this idea of the language, the lexicons of climate and health, is that one, that fast climate change is known through time. And I think Julia has mentioned that. It's through the seasons that are getting longer. They are not behaving as expected. And secondly, that climate change becomes legible through health, through their bodies that no longer recover in familiar ways. And I think it's a connecting theme around climate change, how people talk about climate change and the health. But even before I go deeper to unpack these two observations, I would first like to share just a snippet on background around the two settlements that we've been working in. First one is Kibra. If I was to ask this room how many people know Kibera or Kibra, I know probably will have hands full of the room full of hands, but it's among the largest informal settlements in Africa, and I will actually say in the world. It's much upper, and I think I'll show you a map, but it's historical and also quite significant in showing how informal settlements in Kenya and in the global south are socially constructed, and in this case through tripartite partition and segregation of communities. And that happened in Nairobi. And houses here in Kibra, they're made of what we call mabati, mostly iron sheets, a few mud houses, and even fewer concrete structures, mostly as most of them just bungalows or single story, and others going much higher. And it's in this setting that you get a lot of mix of one, infrastructure deficiencies, vulnerability from infrastructure, economic, but also many other things, including health. The second settlement is Mukuru. And I mentioned here that is the second largest informal settlement along the Ngong River, not in Kenya, along the Ngong River, because Kibra and Mukuru sit along the same watershed. It is much low lying, but I think what is interesting about Mukuru is it's surrounded, it's within the industrial area of Nairobi. And that has implications in terms of how we think about vulnerability, in terms of environmental and industrial pollution. How does that shape the everyday landscape here, but also the basic infrastructure? The housing, not much different from Kibra, is also made of iron sheets or mabati, but a few also mud houses that sit there. But Mukuru is much lower in terms of elevation compared to Kibra. What you see on the left, circle on the left, that's Kibra, much elevated in the much higher parts of Nairobi. But then Mukuru falls on the lowest plains of Nairobi. And this map just shows you where the two settlements sit, but it really speaks about the implications on flooding. And I think also more importantly, connecting to the theme of today, this idea of contexted terrain. I think both Mukuru and Kibra are contexted terrains where land tenure is uncertain. Infrastructure is very provisional. Drainage, housing, and even more services are also provisional. But even more, climate change then adds another layer of uncertainty and compounds the shifting rhythms of both time and health. And over the past 1 year, we have been working with health histories from in Kibra and Mukuru, engaging in 10 households in each settlement. We began with what we call an ethnographic entry that allows us to get a sense of the field before identifying 10 households in each settlement. And over time, from our positionality, it shifted from visitors who had come to get to know about the settlement to researchers who had become familiar figures in those households, because we had several rounds of interviewing. We shared stories, we shared times together, but we were also present in moments where illness happened, where moments where households and family members were recovering. And unfortunately, even during the course of this study, was close to a family that lost a certain member. For most of the folks, a household member, for the most of the folks for the project, there was a story that is told of Mzee Waboma, an old gentleman around 45 with a wife who was diabetic. Last year, we lost that lady. And condolences up to her. And the KDI team actually went out, and in solidarity, they were with the team. That shows you how our position has shifted, but also the ethics of care, especially when you're doing these very long-term engagements, so to speak. I really wanted to mention that in this project. But now, more specifically, we say that from the history, we learn that climate change is first encountered through time, and I cannot share as much as Julia has also shared, but it becomes fast before it appears as damage, before it appears as floods, damaged houses and everything. It is felt in the disturbance of seasonal rhythms. It's how people remember how it unfolds. It's how they anticipate what comes next. It's also known through seasons that are no longer holding their rhythms, the calendars that no longer guide their actions. And most importantly, that their routines now require a level of adjustment. And this work speaks to, and I didn't want to miss this, and even though it's a breadcrumb, I'm reminded by a lot of the linkage between phenomenological lineage and the lived time by Husserl, and really think about time consciousness. And then Charles, who really talked about the temporal orientation in time. So all these things really treating time as rhythms, anticipation, that is something that is lived. And I think that is really, really important in time, and we'll hear a lot of that as well. For example, one resident pointed us that here in memory of how seasons used to move and the certainty that now surrounds them. We used to know the rains will start in March. Now we don't know. I think that's one good quote that shares. And some of the pictures you see are from the KDI team doing their data analysis. And yes, March mattered to this resident. It marked a moment where they could plan for school, for work, for food, for health. But then rains arriving around mid-March were part of an inherited season order that helped organize everyday life. Now that has changed. That reference point has shifted. It feels off to them. And this becomes critical as we continue as well. So time in this case is very practical. It's when seasonal knowledge breaks down, and then life becomes even hard to organize. Then it's also told that in July, we know the call usually only in July. The call is only usually in July. But in August, it's time for a sun. But now the call has taken over August. I think that really speaks to the language that we are getting from here. And what this quote, among many others that we pull out from the field, it points to a slow drift with cold extending beyond where it's expected to sit within the year. It's expected to sit in July. What are you doing in August? Go back. But this change is subtle, but also accumulates, because it's also point towards how even people feel, how their bodies respond, but also how long the discomfort can last. Because now the discomfort of July is going into August. That's terrible. But then as I continue, we also learn that alongside the months and season, people also track climate change within the day itself. So that language of seasons and it used to be can also be felt in the intraday variability of the intraday vulnerability. One resident told us that around the time we'll be experiencing cold, but we know that the cold will come in the morning and the evening, in the middle of the day, the sun will be out a little bit. So this has shifted. The intraday rhythms have also become less stable, and they're shaping how people move, how their homes feel, how their bodies cope, and over the course of a single day. So even as we think about the seasons, but also within the day, how might that help us understand how people talk about climate change and then health? In the first part, we talked about the climate change being a faster through time, but then what we are learning is that then it becomes legible. It's become legible through health. So it's seen fast through time, and then it settles in the body. It's how then people get to start experiencing it. And what we learn is that these shifts in season and rhythms settle in the body and now appear as illness, and how it long lasts, and how people organize care. And this analysis really draws on the larger theories of embodiment, which I think most of you have read about, and I wouldn't go into that. But also this framing shifting in seasons and daily rhythm and shifting in the body show that at some point we need to think about, even at some point when they talk about illnesses coming together, it actually shows and reveals this idea of syndemics approaches in how people interact and different conditions interact and compound each other. As I go towards the end, that I wanted to say that for example, one of the quotes that we have here, at night and early in the morning, the cold is too much. And that's when the chest feels tight. The chest feels tight. And during the day, you feel better. That really speaks to how the rhythms of life and the intraday variation also shape how people experience health. As I go towards the end, yes, climate change also becomes legible through physical tolerance alongside seasonal memory and disrupted rhythms. People describe climate change through what their bodies can actually endure. And in this quote, heat is usually so intense that I have to change the time I work. Since my job includes fabrication, I cannot manage when the sun is at its peak. Even my wife has to hawk clothes in the evening instead of morning because the heat is just too much. Here, I think heat is registered as a train, but also the body limit. As I finish, I think this concluding remark is more towards, yes, we can learn a great deal about the relationship between climate change and health by focusing on episodic events. We can do that. But there is that the work that we are learning so far shows that we should even pay more attention about the everydayness, how people live through time and how they experience the embodied experiences of health. And listening to this language of seasons and the bodies is especially important when climate has lost its rhythm. It reveals us where illnesses cluster and recovery stretches, but when care becomes everyday work. This allows us to see climate change as it is lived, not just as an environmental condition, but also an ongoing social and bodily experience. Yes, informal settlements, and as Gautam has mentioned to us, vulnerable settlements like Kibra and Mukuru are contested terrain. Going back to the theme of this convening, it's where tenure, insecurity, and infrastructure are makeshift, but it's this contestation that is temporal that also start to shape how health becomes, how seasons also, how it relates to health, how the routines are disrupted, and how body conditions are shaped every day. Because at some point, when it becomes cold, when it's raining, the mabati becomes cold, then it enters my body. There is that relationship about that temporality and contested areas and how that shapes. As I finish, I just want to say a big thank you to the households in Kibra and Mukuru that opened up their homes and lived with us over the time during in the project as we did our health histories. This work wouldn't have been made possible without their trust and the generosity, and even the vulnerability they showed to speak about their experiences. For now, I just want to say thank you.
Thank you. We'll move to Delhi, and I will take the opportunity also to speak to one other methodological question of working in vulnerability. One of the decisions we took when we started the project is we would only work in places that already knew us. So in every one of the centers and every one of the places, we may not have met these households, but these were settlements that had felt the imprint of our work. And that was part of the ethic of saying, what does it mean to come and research? And for us, these are all settlements where we have long-standing relationships that preceded the project and will continue to actually continue after the project. So separating our relationship with these spaces from project cycles has been a key part of the structure of the project itself, and has also been a reason why we're able to do the kind of work around vulnerability, is because we didn't have to first spend 2 years building trust, because we walked into places. The rule was, when you walk into the settlement, someone should say hello. Ruchika.
So now I'm going to move to Delhi and share a slice of some of our reflections that Akbar, Rashi, and I have been sort of thinking about together as we've been working and doing our field work in Bhalaswa, Delhi. So Bhalaswa is located in Northeast Delhi. It has one of Delhi's 3 largest landfills, and it has an associated economy of waste and recycling that is located adjacent to it. And in Bhalaswa, we entered the field with a focus on the connection of livelihood and housing, and really building on deep connections that Akbar already had with the community. And we've been interviewing households of informal waste workers who are engaged in different forms of waste work on and off the landfill and living in proximity to the landfill. So you can see the landfill on the right, and on the map, that's the map of Delhi, and that it's not, I guess, I wish the map was a little bigger because it's very easy to actually spot the landfill on that map. So that map is the land surface temperature, and the red blotch right in the center of that, which shows the extreme heat, is literally the profile of the landfill, which really speaks to the kind of extreme conditions in which people live and work with. And so I'm going to sort of, in the interest of time, skim through a bunch of things on context, but really start with our, our one of the arguments that we've been working with across our sites is the argument of arguing about and thinking about climate change from place. And so what does it really mean to talk and think about climate change from place? And through the year, as we've been speaking to people, something that is really clear is that the landfill poses real challenges of health and dignity, and access to waste is a priority for informal waste workers. So any conversation that comes from Bhalaswa has to hold both of these things simultaneously. So how do you think about the Khatta as a place? When we think from Bhalaswa, this is something that is difficult but extremely clear to us. And so coming to how are people talking about and what is the language of climate change, coming from Bhalaswa, and an argument that is collective in the project is how people talk about episodic and everyday climate change is mediated through their life worlds. And in Bhalaswa, people's lived experience really shapes the way they talk about climate change. It is difficult for people to articulate their experience because of the everyday deep vulnerabilities that they experience. And people have no choice and no space to make choices and respond differently. And it feels like they don't have the right to complain. So it is hot, it is raining, but work must go on. And no matter what does or does not change. So हमें काम से मतलब है work is our priority. This is a common refrain. And there's a lot to unpack within this because given the structural inequalities that exist, there's a knowledge that we need to continue to make ends meet, and this is our priority. And so we really used work and livelihood as an opening to talk about climate change. So while we did our rounds of field work, we discussed a sense of normalization of the situation, but there was a language of endurance, of coping, of getting by, trying to make ends meet where work was a priority. So we hear about how the word jhelna, to endure, responses like putting a damp cloth on your head before going to work, stopping on journeys to rest under trees while cycling to work, taking holidays and taking off despite the fact that in the summer, that's the driest waste that you will ever get. So in the summer, taking 20 days off just because you just can't go to work. And so we hear about climate change through the way in which people talk about hazards, bodies, work, infrastructure, what it means to live near the landfill as a place, built form, and materiality. So in terms of hazards come up through a recollection of critical events and recounting of everyday risks. So we heard about a landslide during December rain that buried 22 homes adjacent to the landfill. We heard about a fire that went on in the landfill for many days in a previous summer. And this is an image that Akbar shared from one of the WhatsApp archives that he had from previous work. We heard about recurring fires in the settlement, the feeling of heat of the landfill, the smoke, the chemicals in the rain, the waterlogging. We heard about impacts on bodies and health. And this here is a long list of a range of health issues that came up through our fieldwork. Some of these are chronic and aggravated during the season. Some of them are associated with the work, for example, dad and skin issues. Some of these are, like English diagnoses like typhoid, which people mention having to deal with every summer. A word that particularly haunts us is ghutan, which translates to feeling suffocated, not being able to breathe. And this was used in many interviews, not just in Phalaswa, but across the North Indian sites, actually, where it captures not just the bodily impact of heat stress, but also the anguish of the intersection of various vulnerabilities simultaneously on a single person. Other examples of not being able to sleep, every nerve aching. We also learned colloquial vocabulary for some diagnoses. So Ras Tadka was something that we learned that, in the village, a doctor, Bengali doctor, diagnosed for febrile seizures. And then in terms of work and productivity, there's a language about not being able to go to work, the seasonal economics of waste work, and waste being damaged during the rains, and stress that is associated with this. We learned about climate impacts through services and spending on water, electricity, physical labor to remove water from the home. What it means to live adjacent to the khatta where there is risk, but there is also livelihood. And then how water comes in the home during the rain, the tarp melting during the summer, the repair work required. And what was really clear was that, another argument that is collective in the project, that the climate change affects vulnerable settlements in particular ways, moving along existing fault lines of risk and vulnerability. So as I move forward, how do people respond to then these climate impacts on health? And I'll share 3 short excerpts of stories. The first is the story of the Hakim and the doctor in the village. And this is a story where a young father takes his toddler for treatment for seizures during fevers. And he takes him from Delhi to the village in West Bengal. And the elders in the community, they advise him to visit a local healer, a Hakim, to pierce his ear with a burial shroud. And the Hakim refuses to do so, and he tells him, you must see a doctor. And the doctor does give him a diagnosis and prescription instead. And this is a story about holding multiple logics together, and there's an ecosystem of different actors here. There is the Hakim, there is the doctor, there's the community, there's the elders, there's the family. The city healthcare system is kind of absent in this story. And as we make sense of this story and see the various logics at play here, we are able to appreciate these multiple logics in the context of how vulnerable households are responding to multiple risks together. So there's always help and something more. Because in the same interview, our respondent has shared with us a recent experience of harassment by the police. Most of the waste workers in Balaswa, are Muslim, and the experience of disenfranchisement as a Bengali-speaking Muslim waste worker really translates into not being able to access infrastructure and healthcare in the city. In July 2025, when we did our interviews during monsoon, there were lots of reports of detaining, police detaining migrants, and so this experience of disenfranchisement really translates into people holding on to their ID cards in the village, so not being able to access basic healthcare infrastructure in the city. There's, of course, a barrier of language, in city hospitals, but there's also that what happens when your experience when you routinely experience harassment, then how that translates into a gap in trust and care from city systems instead. And so this is a story that we've really been sitting with, and it's not the only such story. So this is a very routine experience in the area. The second story is a story of rebuilding a life after loss. And this is a story of an elderly waste worker who shares with us how he has come to Bhalaswa from the village to escape death. And he tells us that this place and this work has saved my life. So no matter how difficult it is, how challenging it is very meaningful for him. And he tells us how he's been able to do this work, transcending religious identities. He himself is a Hindu. He's received a lot of help from the community. And when he fell sick, the community got together and raised money for his treatment. So really a story about really the community coming together and for health. And then the last story I'd like to leave us with is the one on we must talk about health. And this is another young waste worker who has, he works with the solid waste management department, but he is not recognized in any form. And he, after a recent loss in his family, has been deeply thinking about health insurance. And he's a second generation resident, and he's made friends outside the community. And he tells us we must talk to each other about health. We must share knowledge, because you never know who may share something useful. So I think I'll close here for now, and then we can talk more later.
Thank you very much. So our last set and stories is from Freetown in Sierra Leone, and we will go online to Abu.
So thank you very much, everyone, for very beautiful presentations. The presentations actually reflect the different kinds of vulnerabilities that are faced across different settings. There might be different settings, but then we have a thread that cuts across them in terms of really shaping how these vulnerabilities happen. This is a reflection, the untold stories of climate change. It is a reflection of the daily crisis that people face in urban and informal settlements in the context of climate change. But we decided to frame it as the untold story because climate change is spoken about very much in terms of the scientific evidence, the IPCC framing, but what is lost is how people experience it, the daily people, the vulnerable people within these different settings. So how people experience it, like Gautam was saying earlier, it is about these narratives setting the scene, in really trying to speak to the different realities that people face that cannot be measured only by epidemiological data or scientific evidence, but what people feel on a daily basis. So if we go to the next slide, I'll just provide you a little bit of context about the Freetown informal settlements. So Freetown is a city, is the capital of Freetown. It has gone through a lot of crises. For example, 11 years of conflict. We've had Ebola, we have COVID-19, and there was a mudslide that killed over 1,000 people. And so as a result of the uneven development between urban areas and rural areas, there has been rapid urbanization and migration of people to the city, starting from the conflict onto this period. And so informal settlements have been spreading. So at the moment, we have between 68 to 72 informal settlements. And in fact, the World Bank study states that the entire land space of Freetown, about 36% of informal settlements sits within these spaces. So it tells you how, spreading, how the informal settlements are spreading. But then when we talk about informal settlements or maybe vulnerable settlements, like Gautam said earlier, we have to think about historical narratives. For example, colonial legacies in terms of how the city was planned. There was a time in Sierra Leone in the 1900s when Freetown was divided between planned and unplanned spaces, where we had the colonial authorities living in the planned areas as a result of the epidemiology of malaria, which was coming at the time. So the city was divided, between the colonial authorities and and the residents. And so during the conflict period and even in post-conflict period, this has continued to shape how services are divided, and it also impacts how people experience vulnerabilities within these settlements. So if you go to the next slide, it is going to talk about the different settlements that we've worked in and how they face different kinds of vulnerabilities. So for example, we have Moiba, which is a hillside settlement in the far east of Freetown. It experiences rockfalls, structural collapse, mudslide, and all of that. So this comes as a result of the fact that people within these settlements are poor. They're unable to afford the services of an engineer, so they use their ingenious knowledge to construct houses. So as a result of that, they experience these different kinds of vulnerabilities. So if you look at the map, you can see the different kinds of hazards that they have experienced in the past. So this is from a GIS mapping that was done by community members themselves, with us working with them. And the next slide talks about the next community, which is Kokube. It is a hillside settlement which also faces high tides and, a coastal settlement which faces high tides, flooding, as a result also of the unplanned nature of it. So when it rains heavily, residents are very likely to experience flooding and different kinds of vulnerabilities. And the last settlement I'll speak about is Colbert. So Colbert is in the east of Freetown towards the central. It's a settlement that is very much adjacent, one of the largest dump sites in Freetown. So the dump site was established again as part of the urban infrastructure development. So when the settlements, when the dome site was built, communities started to experience excessive flooding as a result of the fact that it is not controlled and it burns very often, and so people experience smoke and these kinds of things. So I'll just now focus specifically on Moiba community because we have developed a story that really talks about one of the participants that we engaged. Of course, we conducted narrative interviews across 3 rounds with 30 participants across the 3 settlements. So every month we went to each of the to the participants and spoke to them about how they experience, first of all, or understand climate change in the first place, how they vocalize it in their local languages. And then the second interview was about how climate change interacts with different layers of vulnerabilities like housing, like livelihoods and sanitation. And then the third one was about how people respond to climate change in their different ways in terms of adaptation. So in Moiba, we are talking about the story of a woman who is called Bintu. We'll come to that later. But I just wanted to provide you a contextual development of, come back to that slide, please. Sorry. So I just wanted to provide a contextual understanding of how this settlement has developed. It's one of the oldest informal settlements from Freetown, which started around even before we had independence. So it was a lush farming settlement, which started to receive people from the provinces who wanted to settle in Freetown, but then they were doing basically farming. And then as a result of colonial and post-colonial development, it was established as a quarry for urban infrastructure. A quay was built from it, and then major streets from the stone that was stones that were mined there. And then later, from that period on to the 1970s, we started to see gradual migration, which was the pre-conflict period. And then during the conflict period, we started to see civil war leading to migration, and then settlement expansion was happening. And then after the war, some of the infrastructure projects were completed, and then the quarry was closed. But then people started to use it privately for, construction of houses and development. And so the construction of houses, the clearing of vegetation covers people began to experience infrastructure collapse, flooding, and those kinds of things within the settlement. And the next slide talks about place, identity, and social mobility. So like Ruchika mentioned, place is one important lens that we use to understand how and why people experience certain kinds of vulnerabilities. A lot of urban literature talk about place, as a lens to explore inequalities, vulnerabilities, exclusion, and deprivation. So we are focusing on the life of Bintu, who is a woman in her mid-40s, who was born in Moiba and continues to live within this community. So it tells that her narrative reflects is drawn from the thinking of social determinants of hers. For example, where people are born, the family in which they live determines their social mobility. So she was born in this community, she has lived through poverty, and she's raising her own 5 children out of this one. And so we asked her to really try to understand her background in terms of how social mobility was likely to shape her life. And so we understood that Bintu did not go to school in the first place. And so going to school, social mobility really explains how people's lives are shaped. So for example, she did not go to school because of gendered responsibilities, because her mother wanted her to look after other children. And in fact, she got married at the age of 14, which typically is a child marriage. And as a result of that, it has been very difficult for her to rise through the ranks. And so because of that, she continues to live in poverty. So the next slide talks about climate change and how people understand and experience it. So Bintu says that she understands nothing about climate change, but she lives it. So she says, where there is heavy wind, you will hear those who went to school say that it's because of climate change. But some of us don't understand the actual meaning of climate change. But indeed, she lives climate change because her house is not properly built, there's intense rainfall, and there's intense wind, which rattles her roof, and she's suffocated by extreme heat at night when it rains. And so 2 years ago, you can see in the picture, a boulder fell on her house, which led to near collapse, and one of her sons really died, almost died in the process. And so the next slide is going to talk about how people generally talk about climate change in terms of their understanding. So you can see how, for example, they talk about intense rainfall, and then they also talk about, the next slide, please. They talk about intense rainfall. They also talk about extreme heat, hunger and starvation, and illness. So all of these create a kind of intersection about how people understand climate change. But there's an interesting one here which says good and bad weather. So weather to them can be good if you use that to your advantage. For example, if you are able to have a good weather to allow you to go to work, then that means it's a good weather. But if there is intense rain that makes you sick, then that's bad weather. So the framing of climate change really is contextual and is shaped by people's lived experiences. So now, in terms of climate change and health, Bintu is asthmatic, and she works in between two physically demanding jobs. Next slide, please. Yes, so she's asthmatic. It is not caused by climate change directly, but it is aggravated by it. So we asked her, what is her understanding of health? And her definition was very striking in the sense that it really goes beyond the biomedical understandings of climate change. And her understanding is linked to the social determinants, the economic, the financial, and livelihoods about climate change. So she says, health means that I am able to work. Being unhealthy means being broke. And being broke is like sickness. If I have money, I can provide food for my family. I always feel sick when I'm broke. So climate change is very layered in terms of how people understand it. And also she talks about climate change in terms of heat. She says, I am asthma patient and I'm allergic to heat. I find it difficult to sleep when the place is hot. I did not sleep last night until dawn due to heat. At night, the place becomes warmer when the door and windows are closed. So also this is framed in the context of housing. When people are not able to have better housing, construct proper houses, even that can lead to the aggravation of health situations that they face. So I'll come to the end by talking about adaptation measures, how climate and livelihoods. So,
Abu,
like
can
I
I
said,
give you just a couple of minutes to wrap up?
yes, I'm wrapping up. So she talks about climate change in terms of livelihoods. So livelihoods are interacted. Livelihoods interact with climate change and health. So she engages in two physically demanding livelihoods, which is gardening and also stone breaking. So she says, if my family and I wake up in the morning and I have nothing to eat, it feels like sickness. So she mines stones, which is physically demanding, and then she works in the garden. But then the interesting part of it is that not that the garden itself is a challenge, but the problem is that the infrastructure that makes them to do their work is a challenge. For example, they don't have watering cans to water their garden, so it increases the level of vulnerability and ill health. But then, despite the fact that she's working too hard and she's asthmatic, she looks forward to a good future to her children because she did not have the opportunity because of her gendered responsibilities and care roles. So she says, I always tell my children that I'm still engaged in stone mining for their sake, regardless of my health condition. I will have stopped doing this work, but I have nothing to do other than this. So my last slide is about really few words of conclusion, which is about saying that climate change is really layered in structural inequalities, in the sense that where people live really shapes their experiences in terms of how they experience climate change interacting with health, with livelihoods, and the place of living. So she uses plastics, she uses construction materials to do adaptation, but these ones are not sufficient because they are not able to respond very well to her needs. So finally, I would say that climate change experiences and vulnerabilities can be addressed if policy processes are able to understand how these vulnerabilities are layered and how people experience it in their daily lives and in their livelihoods, in their health, and in what they do. So thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. So we have about 15 minutes to close up. So I'll just say that at the end, what we leave you with on the screen is the new website. And I want to particularly thank our colleagues, Padma is in the back over there, the team with Ashish and Midun particularly, who's worked on it. That's the site. And I just want to click on the last link that says blog, only to say that the first 10 of these stories are now up. You'll see the breadcrumbs, and if you scroll down, you'll see the stories about heat and maps. And just to say, all of these technical land surface temperature maps are also part of the project. So part of the storytelling is also storytelling through what look like technical maps. And you'll see stories from Kerala, you'll see stories from our sites in Patna, our sites in Karnataka are in Kalaburgi. So just to sort of say that, and there will be 2 new stories that added. That hot pink story that you're seeing right now on screen is about ASHA workers getting a new uniform, which has too much polyester. And so the language of climate change is about not being able to wear the sari because the heat breaks the ability to wear a sari with too much polyester. So I also hope that seeing these stories, you would have begun to sense a sense of interreferencing and collective voice. I think one of the things that we're really trying to do is to not do a story where 4 countries write 4 different case studies from 4 different places. We want our language to meld and merge and speak. And we want place to be respected, but we also want to take the idea of Southernness seriously. And I hope that many of us in this room, when they hear the stories and see the pictures from all the other countries, more than anything, feel an echo of familiarity, feel a sense we know these places, we know these stories. That was always the instinct of Southern urban theory, that there are some places that make you say, I know this place. And we want to take that sense of familiarity seriously, to build and think about language in different ways. All of us know more about climate change than we did when we started our fieldwork. And I think that's also a very interesting way to think about how knowledge has grown. Last call is that there are many, many members of this project in the room. And if they can just raise their hands for 1 second, you will get a sense of them in the back and the front across countries and sites to speak to them. And to please track our blog to see the new stories and the new videos and the new films. And we hope to have one of our screenings in this room when our own film launches from across the India sites, and to think a little bit about the ways of storytelling. Thank you for giving us such a patient hearing and letting the stories have a place to land. And that is really the reason why we took the liberty to tell them to you and to share them this way. So thank you very much, and the floor is open for questions. Yeah, so we'll collect, and so we'll go 1, 2, 3, 4 for first round. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Ian Lodar, I teach criminology at the University of Oxford. That was amazing. Thank you very much. I have an absurdly large question, which you can put boundaries along as you see fit. I think my question, and I thought about this in different ways in relation to all the stories, is about it's about how the project handles what you might call the question of authorities. And by that, I mean there's both an empirical version of this and a theoretical one. I might just say a word about each. I think the empirical one is how do people think about the presence or absence of authorities in relationship to the vulnerabilities in their lives,
Sure.
either as in terms of their absence or as their presence, and as who is deemed to be capable of being responsible or having any kind of agency in relation to the lives that they're leading and the vulnerabilities that they experience. And how has climate change, if at all, changed their sense of who those responsible authorities are and the demands that they make of them? And I guess that's a whole bunch of empirical questions. But I suppose overarching that is the question of what does responsible authority even look like in the context that you've been so evocatively describing?
Sure. Thank you. Chandy.
Hi, I'm Janvi. I'm a PhD student at IIHS, and excellent presentation. I just loved every part of it, and also just loved the ENIC part of it, and this is something which we sometimes tend to forget putting in our research. Having said that, I would like to know a little bit more about the methodology, and I'm coming from a space where the organization I'm associated with, it's called HomeNet International, where home-based worker organizations are also trying to do a study, and they're grappling with the methodology at the moment. They're going to start in February. In fact, they're starting from Kenya, not from Nairobi, but I think from Kisumu or Machakos, and it'd be very nice if they could connect with you and learn a little bit more about it. Our research is based out of India, but I think it'd be really nice to know because there are 10 different locations in Global South where they're planning to do this study. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Maithili. I teach at Kamal College. So my question is, it was something that I was thinking when I was looking at the pictures, especially during your presentations. There were different shades of waste in each of these places. And I wonder if there was, in your research, in the questions that you asked, in your conversations, what was the language of waste that was communicated, and how did sort of the interaction and the sort of structure of waste coincide with their livelihoods? So
Thank you so much also to all of you for the detailed insights into your research. Also, thank you for introducing the word vulnerable settlement. It's something I had not heard before right now. There's something I'd like to hear your insights on, and that's like the term Global South, because I've heard a lot of research how it's used to reinforce power. It has this utopian view of the North as being perfect, and the South, it needs to be fixed according to the rules of the North. And also the misuse of the term. And if I could give an example, I attended a lecture at a renowned institution in London, where the professor asked the students to each select a case study, a Global South case study. And the professor added saying, this case study need not be in a country of the Global South. It can be also a Global South space in London, where it kind of felt like the blame for problems which have arisen in the city are being now pushed to the Global South. And how do we deal with this kind of misuse of the term? Thank you.
Okay. Do one last, only because he's one of our students.
Hello. Hello, I'm Pawan. I'm from Bangalore. Actually, when I was looking at the slides, as Gautam said, materially, all the places kind of looked same. And I was when you said the settlement in the industrial area, or the settlement of a waste picker settlement, or a settlement near the Nala, every time I was it's in Pinya.
Yeah.
So the feeling was real, which is also makes me very interesting because geographically, the cities or places you have taken up is kind of interesting with the same metal, because the one where Nairobi or Kenya is close to equator, and then India's above, and then South Africa, Cape Town is below. So to see climate change in a way similar material is very interesting. So that was my first thing. I wanted to thank you for that. I'm curious to see what the outcome comes out. The second question was something on the lines of memory and rhythm. For example, if I have to give an example, my heartbeat before I took the mic and now, and after I leave the mic is like one sine wave. But what I'm thinking is like, I remembered my grandmother saying that, you know how, when do you know like it shifts from winter to summer is when you have Shivratri.
Yeah.
Shivratri is a festival we do here. So I was thinking like, if I map my grandmother experience of this and the actual noted temperature, this shift, how it is changed and how it is actually linked to memory. And the other thing is rhythm, like, are we looking at rhythm in parallel to what the experience of that person in the vulnerable settlement is? Because like 1.5 years back, similar climate assessment when we were trying to do, it was on the urban flooding. Like Bangalore had massive flooding in September 2022. What I was not able to understand that time was they were telling like this used to happen, now it has changed climate wise, and this is what happens to us. And at the same time, in one of the articles, it said the corporate IT sector of Bangalore hit a loss of around 225 crores or something on that day. So what I was trying to understand was there is a loss on both sides, but like for me, like I've built my house on a like on sand,
Yeah.
but somebody has built a house on a cement. The difference of loss is very different.
Yeah.
But if I compare it with the rhythm, I kind of miss it. Like because oh this happened, this changed. Okay, I moved on. But what I feel is with individual, like for example, if somebody had asthma, for them, especially in the vulnerable communities, you actually go back in time.
Yeah.
Like rhythm goes. Like that's what I was trying to understand. If I see it as rhythm, it can vary, but it continue. Like it goes on. But for in life, it doesn't go like that for that particular person because it goes back and come back.
Yeah.
Like you've lost some of the days on all aspects.
Yeah.
So how are you like trying to capture that? Because this is what I really missed to understand that time, and I'm really curious to see how are you trying to capture that?
It's a very good question. Okay, I'm going to give each of us a minute. Okay, pick any part you want, but we're going to be sharp and quick so that we can tell people to come back tomorrow on Saturday and talk to us more and also do some work for our research team. So Mathews, I'll go to you first.
I thought I needed another mic, but I'll start in the order of how I remember it. One, the question of authority. I think it's a good one, and I think in hindsight, it's something worth unpacking in this project. And we do that when it comes to response and copying. I think it's a whole other argument that we make. But in this context, depending on whether it's everyday and episodic, I think that can help us even unpack how governance looks like on an everyday and episodic perspective. But in terms of major episode, when there is collapse or when the things that order is disrupted, more often in this vulnerable settlement is the informal governance systems that actually take control and get things done. Yes, they do have relationship with the government and other local authorities, but I think there is a big shift in terms of how the informal governance systems work. So actually, there is a paper we are writing about how informal governance can actually shift over a 24-hour cycle. That is, in the evening, you get gangs setting up bridges during a flood for people to cross. That is one way in which power is shifted across time and space, depending on what is happening. In terms of methodology, happy to talk to you in terms of Kisumu and Machakos. We do have work going on and a lot of interest in this, what we are calling secondary cities and booming towns. So there is potential collaboration and also chat just to share some of the networks we have. But in terms of method, I don't know collectively, Gautam, I'll let you talk about that just for summary. I think I'll let the other team members share. But to respond, I didn't get the argument quite well in terms of rhythm, but I think it's something probably maybe a team member could tackle. But when I hear rhythm, it is this idea of what was thought to be normal and now it's no longer normal. And it's really important because more often in the language of climate change, we are looking at frequency, duration, and many other things. But I think how then do we articulate that? How do we articulate that conversation in terminologies that, how do communities articulate that? It's through rhythm. I think I'll have a chat with you and probably we could unpack that conversation around rhythm.
Cool, I'll try squish it. So in terms of the question of waste, I mean, I think it's a very interesting site to think from, because waste, specifically in Cape Town, I'm sure it's similar, is a main site of subject formation. So it's how people connect with the state through waste collection, but also through informal contracts via companies. And also, I suppose, othering as well, where illegal dumping, and that's the language that's very pervasive, illegal dumping is blamed. So people who do illegally dump are blamed for climate change effectively and the hazards therein. The question about authorities, I mean, the state is still conceived and imagined as the primary authority or responsible. That's what we've found. But as I kind of put on the last slide, is with the sense of simultaneous disillusionment. We don't think anything's going to change. We know that the city doesn't care about us. We've been abandoned, but also waithood. We're not going to change this because it's not our responsibility. We're not going to fix the steps because we're renting from the city of Cape Town. And I think the question about authority is interesting because you kind of have a climate change discourse seeping into local government policy, but it hasn't yet, I don't think we've yet seen the impacts of it. For example, in the disaster risk management body, which is being increasingly mobilized through the language of climate change to kind of enforce evictions and move people off specific sites, and also kind of shirk responsibility for the inadequate infrastructure. So by saying, yes, but it's because of informal settlements living on the drainage or settling on drainage infrastructure that the flooding is so bad. And so I think the idea of, climate change being mobilized through these authorities will be interesting also in relation to rhythm, how that can be used to expedite and make faster the kind of crisis that is in these zones. But I won't comment on it now, but I think the idea of memory and rhythm is very interesting, specifically because we're speaking about sites where people are moving in and out. And so memory isn't connected to the site and the temporality isn't connected to the site, but it's shaped by like change between rural urban migration and also urban to urban migration between different settlements. Yeah.
Okay, the first thing on authorities, there's a lot of awareness of how deep structural inequality works. And so there is a sense of disillusionment that something can change, but it's different from person to person. And so depending on who you speak to, there are different ways forward. We also entered with, through a community of activists. And so different people have different dispositions and different ways of understanding what's possible and where the bar is. But there's a lot of disillusionment because so far nothing has really shifted a great deal. We did interview one doctor that practices in a government healthcare facility adjacent to Bhalaswa, and something that she said really stuck to me, which is she was like, "Hum kuएं के मेंढक हैं, we are frogs in a well," and literally talking about how they've never been. Just a complete disconnect of to the landfill, which is 0.5 kilometer from the site. So I think we have a huge gap in terms of just how authorities see people and see what they need to be working on, and how health and housing intersects. And so that's something that I think is staying with us from this fieldwork. I'll stop for now so that others can also answer.
Yes, I will. I just use this because I'm wary of the time to take one closing comment on behalf and apologize to Abu just because we are already over. And just to say a couple of things on the thing. I think part of the question of authority is that conceptually, informality is meant to allow us to question the notion of authority. whether it does through employment, whether it does through the state. So these are settlements that no one created by intention, but everyone created by intention. They are in dialogue with the state, but outside the state. They are regulated, but deregulated. They are constantly negotiating forms of authority. And one of the arguments about our method also is that authority is not just institutions, state, and police power. It is language, knowledge, and expertise. So the taking of the EMIC seriously, one is to listen carefully, but the other is to treat what we have. So you notice that a lot of the method is also to present the work unmediated, because to make an argument that it is argument already. It does not need to go through a certain framing by scholars to become argument. So I think authority here is playing both in, and what's interesting to us is that in what the research is telling us that we instinctively knew, is that who becomes the relevant authority is absolutely changing every minute and every time. It's different in a flood, it's different in a festival, it's different when you ankle your knee, it's different when the fire breaks out, it's different when it gets colder. And so there is a constant production of what is the right authority. And no authority stays authoritative forever. And no one who is without authority cannot suddenly become the right authority. So that movement is part of what makes these settlements dynamic. And I think that's really important to us in some ways. On the method, I'll say the two kinds of engagements. One is that it is a method that requires you to know place before you know person. So we, when you think of waste, there are members of our research team who are waste workers. So for us, waste is not an object. Waste is our team. They are conducting the interviews on health. But when they ask questions of waste, it's because they are waste workers, right? So those distinctions are very important for us. Not all the settlements actually have the same materiality purpose. Many of these did, but the other settlement in Delhi, for example, is Jaitpur, which is an unauthorized colony on the Yamuna that is entirely brick and 3-storied, etc. Right? But both for Balaswa and for Jaitpur, we knew these places. We had come out of a history of settling that one of our students had written. Jaipur was part of the Maybe Delhi planning campaign. So we had fought the Zono thing with their Sangharsh Samiti. So the other researcher knew them. So my point is that when we say we do ethnographic methods with life histories, what we don't say is, when did you first meet the person whose history you're telling? When did you first see their neighborhood? A life history in a neighborhood is different from a life history when you took some time in the project to become familiar with the place, where the field was actually just the field. For us, these are not field sites. These are neighborhoods in our cities. And that is a methodological question and a methodological choice, right? Every one of these institutions are institutions that work with communities. So for KDI, this must be the 100th project in Kibra over 15 years, right? And when we are walking through Kibra, we see the other projects, right? So that part of the method is not just life history. Part of the method is a history of engagement that creates trust, so that life history can actually be held. And I wanted to make that out. I think the question of waste is critical, but I think the question is not that you just see waste everywhere. It is that the reason why there is a southernness, it is not the global south as a region transnationally. The notion of a southernness, right, is that the way these settlements have been inhabited is similar. They have been inhabited with a certain tension with the logics of law. They have been inhabited with a certain tension with dominant social formations. They have been inhabited with an incrementality. In these settlements, housing is time. It is not a structure. Housing is life. Housing is wage. Right? When you build the next floor is when your daughter is ready to finish school. When you hold back, right? So housing is inseparable from time. And housing is also a rhythm. Right? It's not just risk that is a rhythm. And so when I think a little bit about what makes this Southern, it is not just that we are countries in Africa. It is that the production of space and the meaning of housing is similar in these places. So if in London, you can occupy a land, protect it from the police, build it slowly over 12 years, slowly getting one paper at a time, then London can be as Southern as any place. It is not vulnerability, it is process. It is an ontological category of a way of producing space that is not real estate that you buy or rent. It is not a house that has a door that locks when you move in. It is a house you build as you live in it, right? And I do think there are many places in the North where housing is produced this way, at which point it behooves us to recognize that. On the question of the misuse of concept, there is no concept that cannot be mislabeled or misused. You know, for us, this is a Southern project led from the South. We are actually happy to say we don't really care what London is saying about it. That's all I have to say about that. And if they are seeking the South, good luck to them. But our South is for us. Our references are to each other. We speak horizontally and we don't care to translate. And I think that the point about rhythm is very powerful to me. But what I would say to that is even that sense of going back is felt in the present. You don't actually go back. The problem is that when you are in the present, you have a sense of falling back, but you have no choice but to move forward because that's how time works. And one of the struggles with memory and time is that you invoke memory to understand the present. Every good historian will tell you, we write history to understand the present, not to explain the past, because you write history from the present. So the question is, what do we use memory to tell us about ourselves in this moment? And the challenge of time, I think, is important because climate change is pushing us, especially in its technical language, to think of the future. Think of your children. Think of the next generation. Think of 70 years from now. It's too late. It's too late. 1.5, 1.75. It's breached. It's done. We're already done. Don't take that flight. Take the flight. Who cares? Take the straw. Don't take the straw. The problem is that we are supposed to imagine a horrific future, right? But futurity cannot be the only rhythm that is talked about. So how do we talk about futurity in a way that respects the present? I think that's the question of rhythms and time, right? So which means when do we use memory to talk about the future? So you can also say, I remember what it was like, and I'm not going to let it be like that for my children, which is what Bintu said in Freetown. So I think memory has to be seen as something that isn't given. It is produced. It is a form of storytelling and understanding where you are right now and what the future holds. So I think if we think of memory as a dynamic sense of rhythm that is always told in the present, then we can allow it to go back, forth, side, and circular, because it helps us understand the way people make sense of time, right? And part of what Mathews was saying about phenomenological approaches is that in certain places, all human beings struggle with telling their story and how to navigate history, biography, and memory. Because I tell my story through my memory and what happened to people around me, but also what happened around me, right? That's why when you ask people in Delhi when they came to the city, they say before 84 or after 84. Because we all tell our stories through history, biography, and memory. And unpacking that can help us, can tell us how people make sense of this moment. And if we don't understand how they make sense of this moment, we can't ask them to think about the future. And I think that's true not just of climate change, but it's true of futurity in general. But like Matthew said, part of the question of climate change is the question of time. So I think there's lots of unpacking to be done here in what we can pick up. But hopefully, one of the things that we have been able to show you and show ourselves is that there's a lot of, like Raymond Carver wrote, one of my favorite short stories. What do we talk about when we talk about love? Right? Partly our work is what do we talk about when we talk about climate? And if we can shift that a little bit, maybe the debate will leave the IPCC. Okay. Thank you very much for giving us time. Good. Yeah.